How to make a great podcast. It's pretty easy to start up a podcast and make a few episodes. All you need is some basic audio recording and editing equipment. To make a good podcast, though, requires a strong concept, a dedication to quality, and the enthusiasm to connect with listeners. Seek inspiration from podcasts and podcasters you like, but make your podcast something that suits your passion and goals. And don't forget to have fun with it. Creating interesting content. Listen to podcasts for ideas and inspiration. If you're interested in making a podcast, you probably already like listening to them. Look for common factors in the podcasts you like listening to, and use them to help you brainstorm the format and focus for your own podcast. For instance, do you prefer true crime or humor podcasts? Do you like podcasts with one, two, or many hosts, and with or without guests? How long do your favorite podcast episodes tend to run, and how often do new episodes come out? Get inspiration from other podcasts, but don't try to copy their success. Maybe, for instance, you could focus your true crime podcast on historical but relatively unknown crimes rather than recent ones. Choose a podcast topic that you're passionate about. There's no magic formula for making a hit podcast that draws in a huge audience. Your best bet is to create a podcast that covers material you're excited about, that you'll have fun discussing, and that you'd want to listen to. That way, no matter how many other people end up tuning into your show, you'll produce something that you can be proud of. For instance, if you have a passion for cinema history, you might develop a podcast that uses each episode to delve into a classic movie that may be new to your listeners. If you read interviews with well-known podcasters, you'll find that many of them have no clue why their podcast is a hit. However, they'll nearly always say that they really enjoy making their podcasts. Determine which format suits your topic and style. There are no rules when it comes to making a podcast, which is, of course, one of the format's most appealing qualities. That said, podcasts do tend to follow one of several common formats, including interview, in which the host or hosts chat with one or more guests; monologue, in which a single host speaks on a given topic; multiple host, in which two or more hosts banter back and forth; narrative, which is similar to a monologue but focuses on a particular story; mixed, which simply means that the format of the podcast can vary by episode. Put in far more time preparing than you do recording. Sure, you can make a podcast by simply hitting record and saying whatever comes to mind into your mic. But good podcasts, even unscripted ones, require a great deal of research, learning, and preparation. Many podcasters spend at least 10 hours preparing for every hour of podcast they record. If you're relating a story or analyzing a topic, you need to research the issue in detail. Listeners must be able to hear and feel your mastery of the topic. If you're interviewing someone, take the time to learn as much as you can about them, and, if possible, interact with them beforehand to build a rapport. Even if you want your podcast to sound off the cuff, you should still have a solid preliminary grasp on any topics you might plan to cover. Write a script or sketch out the content for your podcast. Scripting or sketching should make up the most important part of your prep time. That way, you can be confident in what you want to say and how you want to convey it, without having to overdo it on the editing and re-recording afterwards. For a scripted podcast, write, revise, and rewrite your script several times, and have people you trust read it over for clarity and style. Then, practice it several times so you sound like you're speaking naturally, and not just reading a script, during the podcast. For an unscripted podcast, sketch out the broad strokes of what will be covered, when, and how. Leave lots of room for improvisation, but give yourself and any co-hosts or guests a framework to work with. Pretend you're talking to a single member of your target audience. This is one of the keys to a great podcast. You want each listener to feel like you're speaking directly to them. Script, sketch, and perform your podcast with an image of your ideal listener in your mind. Imagining your target listener will help you shape the terminology you use and the overall tone of your podcast. For instance, if you're making an astronomy podcast for people who don't know much about the subject, you'll want to simplify the terminology you use. If you don't have a target audience in mind, or simply want to aim for an audience of anyone, picture your listener as a friend or family member who you know well. Would your podcast resonate with them? Would it feel like you were communicating directly with them? Producing your podcast. Gather the necessary recording hardware for your podcast. In theory, you can record and upload a podcast using nothing more than your smartphone. At the other end of the spectrum, you could make your podcast in a recording studio with state-of-the-art equipment. To make a podcast of respectable quality without spending a fortune, you'll want to aim for somewhere between these two extremes. Try to acquire essential pieces of equipment, like the following: a laptop or desktop computer. Practically any model will have the capabilities you need to create a podcast, although some higher-end computers may come with better audio production capabilities. A microphone. A mic that attaches to your computer's USB port will work, or you may want to consider an analog mic that uses an audio interface to connect to your computer. Headphones. Here again, a basic model will do, or you may want to invest in higher-end equipment. A pop filter and mic stand. These aren't essential, but the pop filter, basically a screen placed between your mouth and the mic, will definitely improve your podcast's audio quality. A sound mixing board. This is another non-essential option, but it will enable you to produce much higher audio quality. Record your podcast in a room with at least basic soundproofing. Using a recording studio probably isn't in the budget for your podcast. In reality, recording in your bedroom or basement will work out fine if you take some simple soundproofing measures like hanging curtains and laying down thick carpet. Even small soundproofing measures will noticeably improve the audio quality of your podcast. Use DAW software to edit your podcast audio. Digital Audio Workstation (DAW) software enables you to edit and fine-tune your podcast recording. Many desktop and laptop computers come with DAW software, or you can choose one of many software options. Free or low-cost DAW options will typically get the job done and may be all you need for a basic podcast. However, higher-end DAW options may give you far greater capabilities to produce a professional-sounding podcast. GarageBand DAW software comes preloaded on Macs. Magic's Music Maker Plus is a common starter DAW for PCs, with a free trial option. No matter what DAW software you choose, use it to its fullest potential. Take the time to fine-tune the sound quality and edit out things like long pauses or dull tangents. Choose a podcast hosting service that suits your needs. Just like with your hardware and software, you'll have many options to choose from when it comes to podcast hosting services, which are digital platforms that allow you to share your podcast with listeners. Some are free, while others require payment, but paid options aren't necessarily always superior. Evaluate several services and choose the one that suits the needs of your particular podcast. You'll upload your podcast to your chosen hosting service's site, and they'll create an RSS feed that will alert listeners to new episodes and enable them to download the content. Take a closer look at services that host podcasts that you enjoy, host podcasts similar in content or style to yours, and offer the type and level of customer support you need. Talk to other podcasters you know for recommendations. SoundCloud, Libsyn, and Fireside are just a few of the many hosting service options. Produce consistent content on a consistent schedule. Podcast listeners want to know that they can put on their headphones every Monday morning or Wednesday evening or whenever else and have a fresh, high-quality edition of their favorite podcast ready to go. Once you decide on a production schedule weekly, for instance, stick to it. If you're not there when listeners expect you to be, they'll look elsewhere. Treat every episode like it's your first and most important podcast. You never know how many first-time listeners are tuning in, and you don't want to turn them or long-time listeners off with substandard content. Your podcast isn't likely to be more popular if you release new episodes on Mondays or Fridays, or at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. What matters most is that you stick to the release schedule that you set. If you can't make an episode deadline, complete it as soon as possible after the deadline. Building your audience. Let your audience know that you want to engage with them. If you want to build a dedicated audience, don't let your podcast be a one-way street. Give your audience numerous ways to get in touch with you. This will help them feel like they have a real connection to your podcast, and it gives you valuable audience feedback. Of course, social media is a great way to engage with listeners. You can either interact through your personal social media presence or create one specifically tied to your podcast. Don't ignore options like email, voicemail, and maybe even old-fashioned fan mail. Promote your podcast as many different ways as possible. In addition to having a strong social media presence, rely on things like old-fashioned word of mouth. Don't be shy about telling everyone you know to give your podcast a listen. And ask them to tell their friends. Give anything a try. Print up flyers for the local coffee shop and bookstore. Make a t-shirt and wear it around town. Have fun with spreading the word. Build name recognition as a guest on other podcasts. Podcasters tend to view each other more as comrades than competitors, so feel free to ask around for advice. Better yet, see if you can wrangle a spot as a guest on one or more other podcasts. The more popular, the better. As a guest, you can promote your own podcast to your host audience. Return the favor and invite your host to be a guest on your podcast. Take the opportunity seriously. If you come off as well-spoken, interesting, and charming as a guest, there's a better chance you'll draw listeners to your podcast.